There are cities that make a point of impressing you immediately. Everything in them seems designed to be photographed, consumed, and forgotten a few hours later. Budapest doesn't work that way. Budapest doesn't seem interested in pleasing anyone. The city moves at its own pace, ancient, elegant, marked by time, and strangely comfortable with its own scars. In some streets, it resembles the great imperial centers of Europe. In others, it seems like a stage set that hasn't yet decided whether it belongs to the past or the present. Monumental facades share space with weathered walls. Yellow trams cross avenues shrouded in light mist. And the Danube cuts through the city like a silent line separating two completely different identities. There is a constant sense of contrast here. Budapest is sophisticated, but never overly polished. Beautiful, but in an understated way. There's a certain elegant melancholy hidden in the architecture. The old cafés, the metro corridors, and even the way people walk the streets. Nobody seems to be in a hurry to impress you, and perhaps that's exactly what makes it so interesting. Our presence here wasn't exactly planned either. A few days earlier, the destination was different Ireland, gray skies, old pubs, coastal roads. But like almost every real trip, the plans began to crumble even before boarding. Cancelled flights, broken connections, impossible schedules. And suddenly, without much time to think, Budapest appeared as a last-minute alternative. Perhaps the best cities are precisely those you haven't had time to imagine. From the plane, Budapest seemed silent. A vast expanse of historic buildings illuminated by a cool late-afternoon light, while the river reflected metallic hues under a heavy sky. It lacked the immediate impact of cities like Paris or New York. It was something different, more subtle, more difficult to decipher, and honestly, maybe even more interesting because of that. The first contact with the city happens quickly. The sound of the train tracks, the wind blowing through the wide streets, the smell of smoke rising from small restaurants hidden among centuries-old buildings, the constant flow of yellow trams cutting through avenues surrounded by buildings that have survived wars, occupations, and revolutions. Budapest doesn't seem like a place designed for tourists. It seems like a city that continues to exist independently of them. Still, at the airport, we tried to sort out one of the most basic things for any trip: transportation. In theory, the plan seemed simple. Buy the famous 72-hour Budapest Go Pass and unlock the entire city. Public transport, discounts, entrance fees, maybe even a river tour. At least that's what we imagined. In practice, we only bought a regular transport pass. No cruise, no museums, no premium experiences. Only buses, subways, and trams. For a few seconds, it seemed like the first mistake of a trip that clearly wasn't following any organized itinerary. But looking around, perhaps it was better that way. Budapest seemed exactly the kind of city that should be discovered without many layers between you and it. And there's something almost cinematic about the public transport here. The trams glide slowly along the banks of the Danube while silent passengers observe the city through fogged windows. Ladies carry flowers. Men in suits stand motionless, staring into space. Young people board wearing headphones as the golden light of late afternoon streams through the metal carriages. Everything in Budapest looks visually interesting, down to the smallest details, even the mistakes. And on that first night, still not fully understanding the city, we made perhaps the most predictable mistake possible. We went to dinner exactly where all the tourists go. On the banks of the river, surrounded by elegant lights and tables perfectly positioned for the view. We ordered our first Hungarian goulash. The dish arrived steaming hot, loaded with paprika, served in a setting too beautiful to be cheap. And at that moment, looking at the bill as the budget began to crumble on the very first day, we realized something. Budapest probably wouldn't be the kind of city that reveals itself easily. But perhaps that was exactly what would make this trip worthwhile. As the night wore on, Budapest began to change its character. During the day, the city seemed monumental, almost austere. Historic buildings silently observing everything while tourists crossed bridges, trying to follow maps on their cell phones. But when the lights began to reflect on the Danube and the trams slowed down along the wet avenues, another Budapest emerged. More raw, more human. That's how we ended up in the old Jewish quarter. There's something different about that part of town. The streets are narrower. The facades bear the marks of time. And many buildings seem to exist in a permanent state between decay and reinvention. Old windows share space with graffiti. Small hidden galleries appear among abandoned buildings. And bars occupy buildings that were clearly something else at some point in history. Budapest doesn't try to hide its layers. She leaves everything exposed. There, amidst dark corridors and makeshift courtyards, ruined bars were born. Places built inside buildings forgotten after decades of hardship in the city. Old apartments, factories, and dilapidated constructions that ended up transformed into almost improvised social spaces. There is no obvious luxury here, no perfect finish, no exaggerated attempt at sophistication. And perhaps that's precisely why they work so well. We entered Kurt almost without realizing where the bar actually began. One corridor led to another room, then another, then more stairs, more rooms, more hanging lights, mismatched furniture, bathtubs transformed into chairs, and walls covered by decades of accumulated objects. Everything seemed disorganized, but somehow perfectly alive. The place smelled of beer, old wood, and cold smoke. Voices echoed through the corridors as entire groups disappeared into rooms lit by reddish lamps. In one corner, tourists tried to decipher the menu. In another, people chatted as if they had been frequenting the place for years. Some cities create experiences for visitors. Budapest seems to allow you only to observe. We ordered local beers as the night grew denser outside. A cherry ale that was too sweet to taste like beer and a bitter, almost citrusy IPA were served while we tried to take in everything around us. There was something profoundly cinematic about that place, not just visually, but emotionally. Because ruined bars don't seem designed for euphoria. They seem built to last. For people trying to extend the night a little longer before going home. For long conversations. For shared solitude. For that silent desire to temporarily escape the routine without having to explain exactly what from. And perhaps that's why so many places like that have disappeared. Talking to locals and reading old stories about Budapest, we discovered that many ruined bars have closed in recent years. Some lost their space to hotels. Others simply ceased to exist after the pandemic. What was once almost a cultural secret of the city has ended up becoming an international attraction. Still, some places preserve something authentic, a feeling that's hard to recreate. When we stepped back out onto the street, Budapest seemed even more beautiful. Not in a grandiose way, but with that kind of quiet urban beauty that appears in the details. Golden reflections piercing the wet asphalt. People smoking silently outside bars. The distant sound of metal train tracks crisscrossing the city in the early hours of the morning. And for the first time since we arrived, we had the feeling that Budapest was slowly beginning to reveal who it really was. Budapest wakes up early, long before the cafés fully opened, before the queues formed outside the tourist attractions, and before the boats began crossing the Danube carrying visitors with cameras hanging around their necks. The city existed in a different state, quieter, more honest. It was still cold when we set off towards Fisherman's Bastion. The streets of the Buda region seemed almost empty, bathed in a bluish light that slowly began to fade as the sun rose behind the city. The sound of footsteps echoed on the ancient stones as small groups walked in the same direction without needing to exchange a word. They all seemed guided by the same silent expectation. Because some cities have places that don't entirely belong to the daytime, and that was one of them. From atop the fortress, Budapest finally begins to make visual sense. The Danube cuts the city in half like a natural division between two distinct worlds. On one side, Buda, higher, calmer, almost residential in some parts. On the other, Pest, horizontal, intense, full of movement, monumental buildings and wide avenues. But the most impressive thing wasn't the view. It was an atmosphere. The sky slowly took on golden hues as the Parliament building's facade began to reflect the first light of morning. For a few minutes, the entire city seemed suspended in silence. Even the people slowed their pace. No one spoke loudly. No one seemed to want to interrupt that moment. It may be impossible to explain why certain places have an immediate impact while others have absolutely no impact at all. Budapest definitely belongs to the first group. And there's something curious here. The longer you observe the city, the more details begin to emerge. Small sculptures hidden near the walls, aged balconies decorated with flowers, discreet cafés slowly opening while waiters line up chairs on the still empty sidewalk, a lone violinist crossing a narrow street carrying his instrument on his back. How many unseen stories unfold daily on these streets without anyone noticing? After sunrise ended and most of the tourists began to disappear, Budapest felt almost intimate again. The lights softened, the fortress corridors emptied, and for a few minutes we had the rare sensation of seeing the city at its right pace. There is a huge difference between visiting a city and observing it, and Budapest rewards those who slow down. Later, we decided to look for food away from the most obvious areas. We didn't want to repeat the mistake of the first night, so we started following local recommendations, crossing the old Jewish quarter again, now completely different in the daylight. Without the nighttime lighting and the bustle of the bars, the neighborhood revealed a different personality. Old bakeries shared space with modern galleries. People walked carrying shopping bags while trams slowly passed between facades marked by time. In some streets, Budapest seemed elegantly European. In others, almost brutalist. This duality appears all the time, and perhaps that's what makes the city so difficult to define. On the way to the restaurant, we encountered film crews occupying part of an old street. Period costumes, production trucks, hidden cameras among centuries-old buildings. For a few seconds, it seemed impossible to distinguish where the real city ended and the film set began. But perhaps Budapest works exactly like that. Like a place where past and present continue to share the same space. The restaurant was unassuming. No huge lines, no flashy signs. Just simple tables, warm lighting, and the constant smell of food wafting from the kitchen. We ordered traditional Jewish-Hungarian dishes following recommendations from the restaurant staff themselves. And then that rare surprise happened that completely transforms a trip. The food didn't seem designed to impress tourists. It seemed destined to remain in the memory. The hot broth, the intense paprika, the fresh bread, the slow and comforting flavors. Everything there conveyed a feeling that is hard to find in overly touristy cities. Effortless authenticity. As we watched the activity through the window, it became clear that Budapest was slowly beginning to reveal a version of itself that most people might never see. And perhaps that is the true luxury of traveling today. Not finding the most famous places, but to find moments that still feel real. Budapest has a curious relationship with time. Some cities seem obsessed with the future. They renovate everything, modernize everything, erase any trace of imperfection. Budapest does the opposite. It maintains certain visible marks, as if it understands that part of its identity lives precisely in the layers accumulated over the decades. Perhaps that's why thermal baths make so much sense here. They don't just look like tourist attractions. They seem like part of the city's natural rhythm. That morning, we headed to one of Budapest's lesser-known thermal baths. None of the gigantic queues or crowded pools seen in tourist videos. The place was practically hidden inside a hospital complex, surrounded by tall trees and silent corridors that gave the place an almost surreal atmosphere. For a few moments, it seemed like we were entering a place we shouldn't know. And perhaps it was precisely that feeling that made everything more interesting. The entrance was simple, no excessive luxury, no carefully planned background music. Just calm employees handing out electronic bracelets while local seniors strolled through the corridors with complete ease, as if they had been frequenting the place for decades. Because many people actually attend. There's something fascinating about how thermal baths are part of everyday Hungarian life. While tourists see it as a cultural experience, many locals treat it as routine, a weekly habit, a place to relax, a small, quiet refuge within the city. Inside, the steam completely transformed the perception of space. Light filtered through the old windows in a diffused way, while small pools reflected bluish hues on the stone walls. Some people remained in absolute silence. Others conversed quietly in Hungarian, creating the kind of ambient noise impossible to reproduce artificially. And the most curious thing was the contrast. Outside, Budapest remained bustling, crisscrossed by trams, cars, and tourists rushing between sites. Inside, time seemed to slow down completely. Perhaps true luxury has more to do with silence than with exclusivity. After a few hours, we left the thermal baths almost numb from the tranquility of the place. The cold street air immediately hit our faces as we returned to the hustle and bustle of the city. And Budapest, once again, seemed different depending on the neighborhood we passed through. It's amazing how the city's personality changes in just a few minutes. Just cross an avenue to leave the imperial areas covered in monumental architecture and enter more rugged areas, where small local markets, weathered concrete, and old stations reveal a Budapest that is far less photographed. It was precisely by following this contrast that we ended up seeking out one of the city's most traditional foods, langosh. But we didn't want to try any touristy version served near the postcards, so we followed local recommendations that led us away from the central areas, through residential neighborhoods until we reached an unlikely spot under an overpass. Yes, literally under an overpass. And honestly, it might have been one of the most memorable meals of the entire trip. The smell wafted out even before the stall appeared. Dough frying in hot oil, fresh garlic, melted cheese, and sour cream mingled in the cool afternoon air as local workers, students, and the elderly waited patiently for their orders. No Instagrammable aesthetics, no attempt to appear authentic, because that's simply how it was. There's something very interesting about observing how locals actually use the city, the places where they eat, the pace at which they walk, the way they occupy squares, markets, and stations. And in Budapest, we quickly realized that some of the best places almost never appear on traditional tourist itineraries. Perhaps because real-life experiences are rarely perfectly organized. Sitting close to the movement of buses and trams, eating still warm langosh while the sky slowly began to darken. We had that rare feeling of accessing a layer of the city normally invisible to most people. Not the Budapest of postcards, but everyday Budapest, imperfect, elegant, viva, and strangely difficult to forget. There comes a point in every trip when the city stops feeling new. Not because you already know its streets, but because you're starting to recognize its rhythms. In Budapest, this happened as we slowly made our way through the Buda Castle district in the late afternoon. The wind carried the distant sound of trams coming from the opposite bank of the Danube, while golden light descended on the city's ancient rooftops. From up there, Budapest seemed less monumental and more human, almost intimate. Unlike many European capitals, there's something curiously quiet here. Even in the most touristy spots, the city rarely seems desperate for attention. It simply continues to exist at its own pace, indifferent to the fact that it's being observed. And perhaps that's exactly what makes it so cinematic. We went up to the castle area, avoiding the famous tourist funicular, not only because of the budget, but because Budapest seems to reward small discoveries. We found a hidden escalator among discreet corridors and courtyards, used much more by locals than visitors. It's strange how small shortcuts end up revealing more about a city than the grand monuments. Along the way, workers were finishing their shifts while couples strolled slowly, observing the river below. A violinist played near an ancient wall, with almost no audience. Some children ran between historic columns as if that monumental setting were simply a common part of their childhood. Perhaps it's impossible to live in Budapest without developing a certain natural connection with its beauty. From atop the castle, the Hungarian parliament completely dominated the landscape. The building seemed unreal from a distance, as if it had been positioned there solely to be observed. The more the light faded, the more the architectural details began to gain depth. Towers, windows, sculptures, shadows traversing the monumental facade. But Budapest never allows you to linger on the city's aesthetic surface for too long. And it was while walking along the banks of the Danube that the tone of the journey changed again. Silently lined up before the river are the iron shoes of the memorial to the victims, executed during the Second World War, men's, women's, and children's shoes, all facing the dark waters of the Danube. There is no show there. There is no dramatization. Perhaps that's why the impact is so strong. While tourists strolled by in silence and locals involuntarily slowed as they crossed the street, Budapest seemed to reveal another layer of itself, a city marked not only by beauty, but also by memory. And perhaps that's what distinguishes truly unforgettable cities. They carry emotional weight. For a few minutes, nobody said anything. We just watched the river follow its course as the lights slowly began to reflect on the dark water. The wind grew colder. The movement decreased. And for the first time since we arrived, we had the feeling of understanding something important about Budapest. She doesn't try to hide her scars. She lives with them. Later, as night fell, we wandered aimlessly through the illuminated streets of Pest. Crowded restaurants began to come alive as trams crisscrossed wet avenues, reflecting golden and amber hues on the asphalt. People smoked outside bars. Conversations echoed between centuries-old buildings. In some windows, it was still possible to see illuminated apartments above the city's bustle. Budapest continued as normal amidst all of that. And perhaps that's the most difficult feeling to reproduce on video. Realizing that a city has a whole life happening beyond what the visitor can see. We stopped for pizza almost on impulse. Nothing fancy, no carefully planned experience. Just the kind of simple decision that often happens on the best trips. Because after days of trying to understand Budapest, we were slowly starting to realize something. The city didn't need to constantly impress. She had already found a far more powerful way to remain in memory. In recent days, Budapest has ceased to seem like a foreign city. And that's perhaps the strangest thing about some trips. You arrive without context, without familiarity, without any emotional connection to the place. Everything seems distant. The streets, the sounds, the customs, the language. But little by little, almost without realizing it, the city begins to occupy space in your memory. Certain routes cease to seem unfamiliar. Some tram stations begin to sound familiar. You recognize cafés, street corners, small facades that went unnoticed on the first day. Budapest was exactly like that. Slow, silent, difficult to decipher at first. And perhaps that's precisely why it was impossible to forget her. On our last morning, the city seemed different again. The gray sky reflected on the Danube as vendors slowly began to open small shops in the central market. The smell of fresh bread, strong coffee, and spices wafted through the metal aisles as sleepy tourists tried to decide what to buy before leaving. But the most interesting places were almost never at the main newsstands. They appeared in the details. A woman rearranging fruit with absolute precision, to men discussing football in Hungarian next to a smoked meat stall, a worker cleaning the floor while softly whistling an unrecognizable tune. Small, everyday scenes that would probably happen the same way even if no one were watching. Perhaps that's what transforms a city into something memorable. The feeling that she doesn't exist to entertain you. She simply exists, and you need to learn how to see it. Later, we returned once more to the streets of the old Jewish quarter. Now everything seemed familiar. The worn walls, the narrow corridors, the bars hidden behind discreet doors, the golden reflections streaming through old windows at the end of the afternoon. We entered another ruined bar almost by chance. From the outside, it looked like just another old building lost among dozens of others. But inside, Budapest revealed once again that chaotic and profoundly human aesthetic that makes the city seem alive. Old sofas, makeshift lamps, objects forgotten by time transformed into decoration. People conversing in dozens of different languages while the soft sound of music echoed between walls covered by decades of marks and stories. In many parts of the world, experiences like this end up being carefully orchestrated to appear authentic. Here, authenticity seems to have simply survived. Talking to bar staff, we discovered that many ruined bars have disappeared in recent years. Some have closed, others have become overly touristy. Budapest continues to change, like any living city. And perhaps that's exactly what makes it all so interesting. Nothing here seems frozen in time, not even nostalgia. That last night, we ended up doing what probably defines any unforgettable trip. We stopped trying to follow a perfect itinerary. We just walked no specific destination. The Danube reflected golden light as trams slowly crossed the city's bridges. Couples strolled along the riverbank carrying bottles of wine. Small restaurants remained illuminated behind windows fogged by the cold. In apartments above the main avenues, silhouettes could be seen moving between partially open curtains. Budapest continued living its own life. And perhaps that is precisely the beauty of big cities. They never truly belong to those who visit them. You only pass through small fragments of them. At the end of the trip, we realized that Budapest didn't deliver what one normally expects from a famous European capital. It didn't try to impress all the time. It didn't seem to perform for visitors. It didn't offer perfectly organized experiences or excessively polished moments. Instead, he offered something far more rare: atmosphere, presence, memory. The best moments of the trip didn't necessarily happen in the most famous places. They emerged during tram rides, random conversations, simple meals, quiet streets, and small urban details that probably go unnoticed by most people. And perhaps that's what we'll continue searching for from now on. Not just beautiful cities, but cities that can still be felt. If you've ever been to Budapest, tell us in the comments what place, moment, or feeling stuck in your memory. It could be a hidden cafe, a quiet street, a specific view, or even a completely unexpected experience. And even if you've never visited the city, we want to know, is there any place in the world that made you feel this way? If you enjoyed this journey, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring atmospheric, elegant, and unexpected cities around the world. Because some journeys end, but certain cities continue to exist within us long after they're gone.